Snow can erase a road without removing it from the map. In late November, the mountains of southern Oregon hold their quiet in layers. The Siskiyou National Forest stretches across ridgelines and narrow valleys near the California border. Elevation rises quickly from river canyons to forested summits above 4,000 feet. In winter, these elevations receive steady Pacific moisture. Rain becomes snow. Snow becomes accumulation. Roads narrow. Among these routes is Bear Camp Road, a winding forest road that connects the interior valleys near Grants Pass to the coastal side of the state. In summer, it serves as a scenic shortcut. In winter, it is officially unmaintained. Seasonal gates are not always closed. Snowfall can make pavement indistinguishable from the surrounding terrain. Cell phone coverage in this region is inconsistent. Towns are separated by long distances. After dark, traffic becomes rare. The forest absorbs sound. Wind moves through fir and pine without interruption. Topographic maps show steep drop-offs and river drainages. The Rogue River cuts through deep canyon country to the west. Side roads branch without signage visible under snow. A driver unfamiliar with the region might see only a continuous stretch of asphalt bordered by white. In November 2006, winter arrived early. Storm systems moved through the Pacific Northwest during the Thanksgiving holiday. Snow levels dropped below the higher passes. Road advisories were posted for major highways. Smaller forest routes remained open in name, but not in condition. The landscape did not change its appearance to warn anyone. It simply accumulated snow and waited. By November 2006, James Kim was 35 years old. He lived in San Francisco with his wife, Kati Kim, and their two young daughters. James worked as a senior editor for CNET, a technology news website based in the Bay Area. His work involved reviewing consumer electronics and writing about emerging technologies. GPS navigation devices were becoming increasingly common during this period, marketed as reliable guides for drivers unfamiliar with distant roads. Kati Kim had a background in marketing and public relations. Together, they lived in the city's Noe Valley neighborhood. Their daughters were 4 years old and 7 months old at the time of the trip. In late November, the family traveled north to Seattle to spend Thanksgiving with friends. The holiday weekend concluded without incident. On Sunday, the 26th of November, 2006, they began their return drive to San Francisco. Their route took them south on Interstate 5 through Washington and Oregon. Weather systems were moving through the region. Snow had already fallen in parts of the Oregon mountains. Major highways remained open, though chain requirements were periodically issued in higher elevations. At some point during the drive, the family decided to leave Interstate 5 and head toward the Oregon coast before continuing south. Accounts later indicated they were interested in scenic views and a quieter route. They stopped in the town of Roseburg, Oregon, in the early evening hours. From there, they planned to take Highway 42 west toward the coast and then continue south into California. Night fell early, as it does in late November. By the time they reached the junction leading toward Bear Camp Road, visibility was limited. It was approximately 7:30 p.m. when they passed through the small community of Gallus, near Grants Pass. From there, Bear Camp Road offered what appeared to be a shortcut across the mountains toward the coast. James Kim was using a GPS navigation system in the vehicle, a 2005 Saab 92X station wagon. Consumer GPS devices of that era often relied on mapping databases that did not account for seasonal road closures or real-time weather conditions. The system identified Bear Camp Road as a viable route. The family turned onto the road. At first, the pavement was clear. The route climbed gradually. Snow began to appear along the shoulders. There were no immediate barriers. The road did not present itself as closed. Darkness and forest enclosed the vehicle as it continued higher into the mountains. Cell phone service diminished and then disappeared. The road narrowed. Snow thickened across the asphalt. Tire tracks from previous vehicles were visible in places, suggesting recent passage. James Kim continued forward. The decision did not appear unusual at the time. GPS systems were widely trusted. The map displayed a continuous route. There were no physical gates blocking access where they entered. It was late, and the family had already driven many hours. By the time they realized the road conditions were deteriorating, They were deep into mountainous terrain. Turning around on a narrow, snow-covered road in darkness is not always simple. Elevation increased. Snow accumulated across the lane. Shortly before midnight, their vehicle became stuck. The Saab could not gain traction in the snow. Attempts to move forward or reverse were unsuccessful. The road ahead was covered. The road behind them had already been traversed in darkness. There were no other vehicles passing through. They were alone on a mountain road that would not be plowed until spring. The vehicle came to rest in deep snow along a remote section of Bear Camp Road. It was late on the 26th of November, 2006. The engine had been running intermittently to maintain warmth, but traction was gone. Snow had packed beneath the chassis. The tires spun without progress. Bear Camp Road is not maintained during winter months. Though not permanently closed, it becomes impassable after sustained snowfall. At the elevation where the Kims were stranded, accumulation had already covered large portions of pavement. In daylight, the narrowing of the roadway and absence of recent plow tracks might have signaled the risk more clearly. In darkness, the distinction between road and shoulder blurred. James Kim attempted to free the vehicle. He reversed. He accelerated carefully. The Saab did not move far enough to regain momentum. Snow depth increased as the road climbed. Continuing forward was no longer possible. Turning around would have required backing down a narrow, snow-lined mountain road at night with limited visibility. There were steep drop-offs in sections. The decision was made to remain with the vehicle. At that moment, isolation became operational fact. There was no cell phone signal. There was no visible habitation. No passing headlights appeared. The family had limited supplies remaining from their road trip. They had snacks and baby food. They had clothing appropriate for a late November drive, but not for extended exposure to mountain conditions. The temperature dropped below freezing overnight. The GPS device still displayed a route. The map did not change. Morning would bring visibility, but not assistance. Snow continued to fall intermittently over the following days. The road behind them became increasingly covered. The tracks they had followed were gradually obscured. The point of no return was not marked by a dramatic event. It was marked by stillness. The car was stationary. The forest remained silent. And the distance to the nearest regularly traveled highway was measured not in miles alone, but in elevation, terrain, and winter weather. Morning revealed the extent of their isolation. Snow surrounded the Saab on all sides. The road ahead was white and unbroken. The road behind them was partially covered, the earlier tire tracks fading beneath fresh accumulation. Trees stood close to the roadside. The air was still. James and Kati Kim assessed their situation in daylight. There was no cell phone reception. The vehicle remained lodged in snow deep enough to prevent forward movement. Attempts to dig the tires free produced limited results. They did not have proper snow tools. The car was equipped for highway travel, not winter backcountry recovery. They chose to remain with the vehicle. Staying with a stranded vehicle is generally recommended in winter conditions. It provides shelter from wind, insulation from direct exposure, and a visible target for searchers. The Saab became their shelter. Fuel was finite. They began rationing its use. The engine was started periodically to provide heat, then turned off to conserve gasoline. Windows were monitored to prevent carbon monoxide buildup. Snow was cleared from the tailpipe when necessary. Food was limited to what remained from the road trip: snack items, small quantities of baby food, and beverages. They began rationing immediately. Adults reduced their intake to prioritize the children. Snow was collected and melted inside the vehicle to provide water. Temperatures fluctuated but remained near or below freezing at night. The family layered clothing. The children were kept wrapped in available blankets and jackets. Body heat became part of their survival strategy. The confined space of the car helped retain warmth. Time moved slowly. There was no external reference beyond daylight and darkness. Over the next several days, snowfall continued intermittently. The road became less defined. No vehicles passed. No aircraft were visible overhead during the early days. The forest absorbed most sound beyond short distances. At some point, James Kim exited the vehicle to attempt to create visible signals. He burned the car's spare tire in an effort to produce black smoke that might be seen from a distance. The burning rubber created heavy smoke temporarily, but there was no confirmed observation of it by searchers at that time. Additional small fires were attempted near the roadside using available materials. Battery power was conserved for limited use. The interior lights were not used unnecessarily. Electronic devices were largely ineffective without signal. Meanwhile, concern was growing elsewhere. When the family failed to arrive in San Francisco as expected, relatives and coworkers began making calls. On November 29, 3 days after the vehicle became stranded, the family was officially reported missing. Law enforcement agencies in Oregon and California began coordinating search efforts. However, the Kims' exact route was uncertain. Investigators initially believed they might still be along major highways. Inside the Saab, the days continued. James and Kati maintained routine as much as possible. The children were fed small portions at scheduled intervals. Diapers were rationed. Waste was managed carefully within the confined space. The psychological burden of maintaining normalcy in abnormal conditions required discipline. By the fifth and sixth days, food supplies were nearly depleted. Gasoline levels were dropping. The surrounding snowpack showed no sign of melting. Daytime temperatures remained cold. Nighttime brought deeper freezes. Kati Kim later described the effort to remain calm for the children. Crying required energy. Movement required energy. Energy required calories. On December 2, after nearly 6 days in the vehicle, circumstances were narrowing. The family had not seen another person. The forest road remained unplowed. Weather conditions had delayed broader search coverage in remote terrain. Search teams were expanding their grid, but Bear Camp Road was not immediately prioritized due to uncertainty about the family's chosen route. Inside the car, the margin between waiting and acting became thinner. James Kim began considering leaving the vehicle to seek help on foot. The general guidance in winter survival emphasizes remaining with shelter. However, guidance also assumes searchers know where to look. As days passed, uncertainty about whether anyone would find them increased. On December 2, after discussion, a decision was made. James would leave the vehicle the following morning and attempt to reach assistance. He carried minimal supplies. Snow covered the landscape in every direction. The Rogue River Canyon lay somewhere below the road's western slope. Downhill terrain can suggest access to waterways or settlements, but in mountainous regions it also means steep descents and unpredictable routes. The car remained stationary in the snow. The family prepared for separation. On the morning of the 2nd of December, 2006, James Kim left the vehicle on foot. He wore layered clothing suitable for winter travel but not specialized backcountry gear. He carried limited provisions. Reports later indicated he brought small amounts of food, a flashlight, and basic items that could be transported easily. He did not carry extensive survival equipment. The terrain ahead was snow-covered and uneven. His plan was uncertain in detail. Investigators later determined that he intended to follow drainage downhill, believing that a river might lead to habitation. The Rogue River system runs west of Bear Camp Road through deep canyon terrain. From elevation, water can appear to offer direction. In mountainous regions, however, river valleys are often steep, obstructed, and difficult to traverse in winter. After he departed, Kati Kim remained in the vehicle with their daughters. Inside the Saab, resources were nearly exhausted. Gasoline was critically low. Food was minimal. Snow continued to surround the car. Kati conserved energy and heat as much as possible. She later described nursing the infant to preserve warmth and reduce dehydration risk. Movement was limited. The vehicle doors were opened only when necessary. Outside the immediate scene, search operations were intensifying. By November 29, the family had been officially reported missing. Law enforcement agencies in Oregon, including the Josephine County Sheriff's Office, began coordinating with the Oregon State Police and other departments. Early search efforts focused on major highways and known travel routes between Seattle and San Francisco. Credit card records placed the family in Roseburg on the evening of November 26. Surveillance footage confirmed their stop at a Denny's restaurant in that area. Beyond that, the route was unclear. It was not immediately known that they had taken Bear Camp Road. Weather conditions complicated aerial searches. Snowfall reduced visibility. Forest canopy obscured large portions of secondary roads. Helicopter coverage expanded gradually as leads were refined. Public attention increased when media outlets reported the disappearance. James Kim's employment at CNET drew national coverage. Volunteers joined organized search efforts in southern Oregon. Maps were studied. Road networks were re-examined. On December 3, searchers began focusing more attention on remote forest roads after learning that the family might have attempted a coastal route. Bear Camp Road entered the search grid. Meanwhile, James Kim was moving through steep terrain below the road. Tracks later indicated he descended toward the Rogue River Canyon. Snow depth varied. In some areas, it reached knee height or higher. The descent required navigating through brush, rock, and uneven ground. Inside the vehicle, Kati remained unaware of his exact progress. The separation had created two survival situations instead of one. Days were now measured not only by cold and hunger, but by absence. James Kim's route can be reconstructed through evidence found after the search concluded. After leaving the vehicle on December 2, he moved downhill through forested terrain west of Bear Camp Road. The descent was steep. Snow thinned in some lower elevations but remained present in shaded areas. The ground was uneven, with loose rock and dense underbrush. Investigators later determined that he reached the Rogue River Canyon. The river corridor in that region is rugged and largely undeveloped. Sheer slopes border much of the waterway. Trails are limited and not maintained in winter. Moving along the river requires repeated crossings of tributaries and navigating around rock faces. At some point, James followed Black Bar Creek, a tributary of the Rogue River. Terrain in that drainage includes sharp elevation changes and narrow passages. Snowmelt and runoff contribute to cold water exposure. In December, daytime temperatures remained low, and nights dropped below freezing. Footprints and personal items located during the search indicated that James continued for several miles through this environment. The distance from the stranded vehicle to where his body was ultimately found measured approximately 10 miles in direct line, though the terrain made actual travel longer and more complex. Exposure to cold and wet conditions significantly increases the risk of hypothermia. Water temperatures in the Rogue River system during early December are near freezing. Evidence suggested that James entered the water at some point, possibly attempting to cross or follow the river corridor more directly. Hypothermia occurs when core body temperature drops below 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Symptoms include impaired coordination, confusion, slowed movement, and eventual loss of consciousness. Without dry shelter or sustained heat, survival time in wet, cold conditions is limited. On December 6, search teams located James Kim's body near Big Windy Creek in the Rogue River Canyon. He was approximately 1 mile from the river at that point. The official cause of death was hypothermia. The discovery followed intensive aerial and ground search operations. Helicopters had begun scanning canyon areas after new leads narrowed the probable route. A search crew spotted his body from the air. The search for Kati and the children continued simultaneously. On December 4, a National Guard helicopter conducting aerial search operations spotted the stranded Saab on Bear Camp Road. The vehicle was partially obscured by snow, but visible from above under improved weather conditions. Kati Kim and her daughters were found inside. They had survived 9 days in the vehicle. The helicopter landed nearby. Rescue personnel assessed their condition. They were dehydrated but alive. The children were transported to medical facilities for evaluation. Kati was also taken for treatment and observation. At the time of their rescue, they did not yet know the outcome of James's journey. The mountain road remained snow-covered. The search concluded with 2 survivors and 1 fatality. On the 4th of December 2006, a helicopter from the Oregon Army National Guard flew over Bear Camp Road as part of an expanded search grid. Weather conditions had improved enough to allow more comprehensive aerial coverage of secondary forest routes. From the air, search personnel identified a vehicle partially surrounded by snow. The Saab was positioned along a narrow section of road, its dark frame contrasting against the surrounding white. The helicopter circled to confirm identification before landing nearby. Rescue crews approached on foot. Inside the vehicle, Kati Kim and her 2 daughters were alive. They had been stranded for approximately 9 days. Food supplies were exhausted. Fuel was nearly gone. Temperatures inside the vehicle had fluctuated with outside conditions. The children showed signs of dehydration, but were responsive. Medical personnel provided immediate assistance. The family was airlifted to Rogue Valley Medical Center in Medford, Oregon. Hospital staff reported that, despite prolonged exposure and limited nutrition, the children were in stable condition. Kati Kim was treated for dehydration and exhaustion. News of the rescue was released publicly the same day. Search operations for James Kim intensified in nearby canyon terrain. Helicopters and ground teams extended their efforts west of Bear Camp Road. 2 days later, on December 6, James Kim's body was located near Big Windy Creek in the Rogue River Canyon. Authorities confirmed his identity. The official cause of death was determined to be hypothermia. The rescue of Kati and the children concluded one phase of the operation. The recovery of James marked its end. There was no ceremony on the mountain road. Snow remained along the shoulders. The vehicle was later removed after conditions allowed access. The forest returned to its winter quiet. In the weeks following the incident, public discussion centered on navigation technology and remote road safety. Bear Camp Road had long been known locally as hazardous in winter. Seasonal warnings existed, but signage was inconsistent. After the Kim family's ordeal, state and county agencies reviewed closure policies and winter advisories. Additional warning signs were installed in subsequent years to indicate that the road is not maintained during winter months. The role of consumer GPS systems also received scrutiny. Mapping databases at the time did not always distinguish between seasonally passable roads and year-round highways. Manufacturers later emphasized the limitations of navigation devices and the need for driver judgment in adverse conditions. James Kim's death became part of broader conversations about winter travel preparedness in mountainous regions. The incident illustrated how modern tools can provide direction without context. The Oregon mountains did not alter their terrain. Snow continued to fall in winter. Roads continued to close. The event remains documented as a case of isolation shaped by geography, weather, and decision. Silence returned to Bear Camp Road.